إنجليزي مش هيك. Good morning everyone. My name is Ibrahim Saif. I am associate with the Jordan Strategy Forum and the Economic Research Forum and the Middle East Institute as well in Washington. It's my pleasure to welcome you. We apologize for not sticking to agenda. My colleague, Dr. Ibrahim Badawi, is facing some technical issues, but he will join us probably throughout the session once this issue is sorted. But I would like to give you just a quick idea. I'm sure some of you probably joined us earlier in discussing this exercise that we're doing. This exercise started, and I think also my colleague Nisreen Barakat was part of that earlier endeavor in terms of addressing the issue of stabilization and adjustment. It's basically debt, stabilization, and sustainability, or how some of the non-oil producing countries in the region being examined in the first part of this examination or exercise. And there was some conclusion that have been drawn in that study. And probably in this brief, it was clear that there is serious issue regarding if we to sustain on the same path. The country, namely, that we were addressed, I think it was Jordan, Egypt, Sudan, Tunisia, Lebanon, and Morocco. Yeah, these are the countries which, in many instances, there are some commonalities, but primarily, all of these countries actually are running such huge deficit and need some fiscal consolidation. But more importantly, the assumption was if these countries to continue on the same trajectory, it was clear that this is not sustainable, and they will sort of hit the wall, and it can be a crisis-driven reform. And after the finishing of the first phase of this, they moved to examine in specific country cases. So that's why we are today. After the regional review that was conducted and led by Dr. Ashaq Diwan, whom I think today, because of probably time differences, cannot join us, but he will be listening to the recording of this meeting. They decided to take a deep dive in terms of examining the countries. And here, me with Dr. Firis, who has put great effort to prepare the presentation, which he will share with us just after my introductory remark, and the research assistant, Layth Ajloni, also, who's happened not to be in the country today. But what we have done in brief, in accepting the premises and the main conclusion of the first part, that debt and fiscal parameters are not sustainable. So what needs to be done? Probably it would be the same old story. We will be talking about what we've done. So we accepted to move ahead, and in our analysis, and this is something that we've discussed in terms of the preparatory workshops for that, we decided to start our analysis from 2009. And that was actually, it meant to be because it's right after the 2008 crisis. Thought at least we can start from a normal year. So our analysis would cover almost 12 or 13 years. The challenge that or the question is that, and is austerity measures adequate in terms of addressing the challenges that these countries facing in terms of the fiscal deficit and the debt burden that is accumulated out of that? Austerity alone, definitely, it's not going to be enough. And taking some austerity measures, now I will be focusing and talking about Jordan, but probably this is also common in other countries. Austerity measures will mean cut public spending, and it will probably affect the level of utilities, services that is provided by the government in these countries. It will have social and political ramifications. Can countries weather this? And if they to continue introducing these austerity measures, then how they can also manage and avoid any social unrest or any chaotic or reaction from within the society, given that there is a certain social contract that has governed the relations between the state and the society for a long period of time, in the case of Jordan. And what we're witnessing and what we will see is that while we're taking some of the austerity measures, still the public sector is growing, the private sector, and this is something is growing uncomfortable. It's the private sector very skeptical about what's to come and how they can position themselves vis-a-vis these measures that have been taken. Probably Corona, and this is something that we can discuss through the discussion, how the burden was somehow shifted from the sort of, it's whatever we call it, but the private sector really shouldered a heavy burden during the Corona area. Now, what we need to do is to promote growth. So this is, I think we all agree that growth with some equity and to improve the services that the government is providing, and also ensuring that there is a good governance of this growth and how it's going to affect all segment of society. Something that we have not addressed in the paper, but I think we will introduce it in the second version, is that also there was a lack of trust that is also growing. This is something measured either through the GSF when they do this investment climate survey, or the trust within the society and the trust in the society, in the private or within the stakeholders vis-a-vis the public policy that has been taken. So we will, in the paper, we will be reviewing also the attempts, the several attempts that have been taken throughout the past probably 20 years in terms of addressing some of the challenges that that Jordan has been facing. However, a little in terms of delivery on that level was done. Now, if we accept the fact that the existing policies or paths are not sustainable, then what can be done? Well, we know that public expenditures are very rigid. If you look at it, even within the 23 budget, close to 76% is wages, salaries, interest payment. It's fixed payments. It's very difficult to alter. A little would go to the capital expenditure, even if that is something masking something else, but it's still, at the face of it, it's very little. And the paper will present, how the gross capital formation has been declining also throughout this past 12 years. If that investment is declining, then where the growth would come from, and how we can promote growth that would create jobs, that would be the notion of inclusive growth come into the picture. Well, also we've been different or mixed signals that is coming on transparency and governance and whether we're improving the business environment or not in Jordan. This is something we will be presenting, but also accountability, and that's something that Dr. Zafiris will be addressing. Deteriorating productivity, whether labor productivity or total factor productivity, low participation in the labor market, and hence the concept of inclusive growth is already out, lack of trust in public policy, and the weakening also institutions or the role of institutions. Also, it's the quality of the institutions is something that we need to look at it. Along with this, there are some certain uncertainties, ambiguity, and lack of consistency in terms of what we want to do. So this is like the diagnostic part of the story that we are telling. Again, we're emphasizing that making the transition will take time, but how to manage the transition and how to make it more inclusive and how to regain the trust of, because this is something that we cannot undermine, that the lack of trust amongst stakeholders. And what I have in mind, it's civil society, it's government, it's a private sector, it's investors, it's FD, even foreign investors. With uncertainties and lack of trust, and at the same time we need to take some austerity measures, and we need to promote growth, because we need to, this is where the notion of stabilization comes, because we need to sustain a stable economy, a stable macroeconomy, promote growth, but still we have a challenge in the budget and in the fiscal, and we need to address some of, in a country with a high level of unemployment, the gap between the poor and rich is growing. You need to, really, it's an act of a very delicate balance that we need to sustain in order to be able to move that. So probably we will end up with addressing and raising some questions. Hopefully we can answer. It's how to manage the transition, how to influence the stakeholders' behavior as well, in terms of becoming not optimist, but at least more engaged and willing to engage in a green field investment, how to improve the business environment. And this is not only just to change the ranking of Jordan and improve the laws, because I think a lot of attempts has been done. I was surprised yesterday or the day before when I heard that they are trying to amend the PPP law. I am not sure if that is the case. This would be the third time that we are amending this law, and not a single project was executed under the previous two laws, which tells you that sometimes the way even we made the legislation, although with all the good intention, but this is something just telling you there is something wrong in the way we structure it. And actually, I must say that personally, I was engaged in the first one when I said it's impossible to execute any law, any private sector investment under the umbrella and within the premises of this law. Now, so improving business environment is a real challenge, and you can only talk about it, but in practice also, and the gap between laws and regulations and the exercise and the practice of this is also something that we need to address. For that matter, now Jordan is embarked on a number of initiatives politically, because we keep talking about economy, but we cannot forget that we really need to address some of that. If we accept the notion that bureaucracy is a function of the political structure, we have to look into that. So we have the political, the administrative, and the economic sort of agendas now that should govern the future. So how we can position the conclusion of this paper to help addressing these challenges, and this sort of, it's a kind of a paradox how to do it. But it can be done for sure. It's really need to be, you need to be very consistent in terms of do it, and very determined. Countries around us are also moving quite quickly in that sense. And I will stop here, because I'm sure all what I have said will be substantiated by the presentation that will be made by Dr. Zafiris. And okay, but before invite you. It seems that Dr. Badawi has managed to join us via Zoom. So I will move it to Dr. Badawi, and then we will go to the presentation. Anyway, thank you. And now I leave it to the technical team to address it. I start seeing my picture here on the screen. So I will stick here, Yasmin.
Thank you, Dr. Saif. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can, doctor.
Yes. Thank you, Dr. Saif, and welcome everybody. And let me apologize. I have this in my schedule, but unfortunately, I was very late last night in Ramadan, as you know. So I apologize, but I very much like to thank you for coming together for this important webinar and to discuss the Jordanian case study. And I would like to welcome the authors, the moderators, and the lead commentators, and all of you, and look forward to, tentatively listen to the deliberations and look forward, eventually to have the written case study, akin to the other activities that we have already done for the other five, for some of the other 5 countries, and we are Morocco and Sudan, and looking forward, in addition to this one, to the cases of Tunisia and Jordan. Okay, thank you.
Yes, good morning. I don't know whether I should say good night for our peer reviewer who is in Washington, and it's about 4 o'clock in the morning there. But I saw his picture on the video. So Adnan, good to have you here. The technical glitches continue. And I'd like to thank our Dr. Ibrahim for the introductory remarks and introduction, and also Dr. Ibrahim Al-Badawi and the ERF and the FDL, the Finance for Development Lab, and Ishakti One for this opportunity to update our knowledge about Jordan and what's happening recently. And though this is a joint effort, I have to say I'm presenting it with trepidation. With one minister there, another minister there, a moderator who was also a minister, and and also talking about fiscal from our peer reviewer who was director of IMF for the region some time ago. So Ibrahim, I mean, you are leading the thing, so you are responsible for that, okay? When something goes wrong, the minister resigns, no matter what happened below. In defense, I mean, of ourselves, we say in the paper that this is version 0, and it is version 0. And it will become version 1 after the workshop with your comments and other improvements we will make and updates. And we have several ones to do. And it will effectively come in early May, as Yasmin and the ERF is telling us. So having set the expectations so high, let me start going through what Dr. Ibrahim summarized. First, I mean, no matter whether it's optimistic or less optimistic or even pessimistic view of the situation, it has to be acknowledged that Jordan has been through very difficult period in the last 10, 15 years. And although the global financial crisis didn't have much impact, Jordan was not that integrated, if you want, in the globalized world, and remains so to some extent today. But look at everything else that has happened since, including the last 3 years after the program, the stabilization program with the IMF was introduced, the COVID and the war on Ukraine has shaved off a few points from GDP and whatever dynamism the economy had, and the reforms that could have been implemented that necessitated some delay in this reform. Of course, in the underline, there are some big trucks coming on the way to Jordan. And one of them is the water scarcity, the legacy of NEPCO, and Dr. Ibrahim, I think, was at some point Minister of Energy also, so he can tell us more about it. The climate impact, and I read somewhere that Jordan is one of the most affected countries by climate change. And in the last few years, rainfall has been reduced significantly, and temperatures are rising faster than in many other places. So we have a lot of issues, legacy issues, and issues that are coming, and a big challenge to address them where we start today. So all this, as we say, necessitated various adjustments and postponements of the reforms, and we give credit for all these issues and what has happened. However, the level of expenditures, composition, and taxes and approach is another thing. So progress has been made, and we have to admit that there have been some or many excuses, but still perhaps more can be done. So I would like to broaden a little bit the context and see the development paradigm of Jordan. And I'll do that first by looking what has happened in Jordan since the 1970s. You see here, there was a fast increase with the oil boom up until 1982. That's where the oil prices crashed. Now, Jordan came tumbling down these years, like all the GCC countries and the oil-producing economies. And then it reached the lowest level of per capita income, welfare if you want, by 1989-90. That necessitated a very kind of brutal, if you, in terms of magnitude adjustment, a massive devaluation of the currency. And then in 92 came the shock, the returnees from Kuwait. But look what happened then. Things started moving up, although slowly. They brought money, there was construction, and the ILO in a study estimated that the education level of Jordanians overnight increased by 10% of the labor force. Those who came were more educated than the local population. Now, 10% is a huge number because 500,000 came in a population of 4 million, and the stock was very high, the 4 million, yet the 10% that came, the 500,000, lifted the education level. And you can see now that we had a trajectory there, I mean, mild one, that is moving up. And then it accelerated in 2000s, and has to do a lot with the regional instability, Iraqi exodus, and investment, money laundering, whatever it is. I'm not very well versed in these things. And now let's move now where we are today. Today we're back in 2002. So when Dr. Ibrahim referred to social kind of anxieties, it has been the whole generation that is almost lost now. And the will try to catch up, plus pay the debt that has accumulated ever since. Now let's look at an indicator of the social sectors, which is unemployment. Of course, it started rising after the oil shock of 1982-83, but then it is flat. Now, there can be some reasons for that, obvious, and some less obvious. The obvious one is that it has been jobless growth. Why? As we will argue, or at least that's what the numbers point into, it has been a move away, a move towards low productivity, low value added informal employment, combined with a very high increase in the share of migrant workers. Now, some of it is refugees, but as we have in the paper, this accounts for 10–15% of the increase in the migrant labor force. The rest is others. Migration policy is something that the National Employment Strategy of Omar Razaz at the time already proposed, but this is kind of the obvious thing. We are moving in the structure of private sector that is not conducive to high productivity, demanding more skills and paying high wages. The less obvious one is, if I can use the case of Greece, is the publication of the unemployment figures was not a responsibility of the Department of Statistics, of DOS. It was a responsibility of the government. The government had to sign off the statistics. And what did it do? It published the statistics usually with a delay of 3 years. So by the time they showed an increase in unemployment, which was not as much as it was already gone. Now, this one is the last slide I have in terms of development paradigm and context. This has on the vertical axis how fast incomes increased before the Arab Spring, 2000, 2011. And on the horizontal axis, we have an index by the World Bank, Voice and Accountability, which is a proxy, if you want, for brevity, for democracy, or openness, transparency, lack of corruption, and also ability of the citizens to express their views without fear of being prosecuted. Now, somebody saw it and said, so it's negative. Look at that, it is. So does this mean the choice is between democracy and fast growth? I said, no, this is the choice for Macron today, right? If it is today, yes, you may have to decide whether you issue a reform of the law by presidential decree, and like Macron, you bypass the parliament, or whether you allow things, you kick the can down the road and you say the pension system will explode, but it will not be on my watch, as George Bush was saying in the war in Iraq. Now, why would we have this negative kind of pattern? Of course, there we have China at the top, okay? But China had more than 80% poverty rate before the reform started. So it had a lot of slack, and the Chinese are hardworking and educated. And who are the others at the bottom there? These are all the Scandinavians, Switzerland, New Zealand, and these had high, fast economic growth in the past. They couldn't have that rate in continuously. It's the same thing as families. Tall parents have shorter children, and short parents have taller children. And otherwise, we will end up with giants and dwarfs. So this is the tendency which reflects the developmental trajectory. Okay, that's just to clarify this negative tendency, because somebody told me the issue that I told you, that there is a trade-off between democracy and growth. Let's do this trick now. Let's partition this graph into 4. You don't want to be on the bottom left in the southwest. And if you see there are reds there, guess what? These are all the Arab countries there. None of them was above this kind of quadrant. And just as a digression, if I drop a line there, I don't know whether you can see it, but the countries are Tunisia, Egypt, Syria, Yemen, Libya. South Arabia is there, but was spared because they bought themselves out of the troubles. By the way, Iran is there, but we will not go into that at present. Let's see where Jordan was, right, in that decade. And that was the good decade of the 2000s. And let's see where it was by the end of the decade. So you can see, I mean, the change that has happened to Jordan since 2009, as Dr. Ibrahim said. Okay, I think this gives a context and also how the dynamics of the development paradigm and the social contract. And what happens with countries is when you have a crisis, you want to address it, you introduce something, but this becomes legacy. And then you start firefighting the crisis just to see the day over. I mean, when you are in the middle of a storm, you are not thinking about sunny beaches. You just want to get out of the storm. And this becomes a pattern. I mean, Greece is a champion in this respect, but not the only one. Okay, now let's go to the title and the scope of this paper. And this will be slightly faster because it is boring kind of numbers. And this is the public debt, real GDP, and per capita incomes on the left. And you can see the debt as a percentage of the GDP increased by 240%. It was about 45%, and now it has become 110%. Now there's an arithmetic there that is unpleasant. How do we evaluate the debt and how sustainable it is? It's important. I mean, most numbers say it's 90%. Why? Because they exclude the social security liabilities or the fund there. Now, this is an implicit liability, and the World Bank and JSF, I think, did a study in mid-30s, 2030s, 40s, it will explode. First, the pay-as-you-go inflow will be reduced due to the demographic transition, and then the funds will be depleted. So if we want to be serious, we should start from 110. And most of the assessments are based on the 90%. Anyway, but you see the debt increased for all the justified reasons and external shocks, granted, but GDP did not increase. And per capita incomes have been declining from the previous graph that we saw. And then we have on the right the total budget deficit, right? That it peaked soon after the growth came to a halt, and then it declined by 2017. I don't know how this links with the social unrest that was in 2017 that led to a change in government, led to the London program. But there is more to be done in the paper analyzing this, linking it, if you want, to the social impact. So yes, the debt can be reduced, as you can see, in the primary deficit, but one has to take into account the social implication. I'll say something at the end about the link between primary deficit and debt reduction, which is not that a simple relationship, at least as several people from the IMF have said. Now, let's see at the composition of debt. And you can see the external debt, the share of external debt to total debt has increased. It's not more than domestic debt. It's about 45-55, 45 external, 55 internal, but the external has been increasing much faster. Now, in terms of dynamics, the service of the external debt on the right, the blue line, is much faster, despite the fact that this is on concessionary terms. The external debt attracts about 2 to 3% in interest rate. The domestic debt is about 5.5%. Now, this has implications from the banking sector, the financial sector, domestic demand for funds, and whether they have what may happen to the banks if there is an issue there, especially now that the interest rates are going up faster than we would like them to be. Now, that was a big picture on the debt. We come to the structure of expenditures. On the left, I don't know whether it's very well focused and you can read it, but the bottom red line is the combination of pensions, wages, and salaries. The middle one, the one on the top above that, the second biggest line is military expenditures and security. Then the interest, you can see, and then everything else is very small, including social assistance and the social protection, except for the pensions, which are included in the bottom three lines. These are pensions for the civil servants and the military. If you include the pensions from the Social Security Corporation, eventually the country is paying 10% today, 10%, more than health, more than education, almost 1/3 of public expenditures as a ratio into pensions. And the population, God bless them, is very young and dynamic. Look at the right now, what is happening, and the total expenditure is the yellow line at the bottom, 50%. And what? The bottom line, do we have a laser? The yellow line, the bottom line is 50% increase between 2009 and 2021. And then if you look at the one above, the military did not increase that much above total expenditures, but pensions and wages and salaries really have exploded in the last 12 years. And the most important increase has been pensions. What does this mean? Where did this increase come from? If total expenditures did not increase, how did you increase pensions? Well, as the IMF says, by that. You collapsed public sector employment. Right. The top? Or yeah. This is capital investment, and it has collapsed. And Dr. Ibrahim mentioned that. How can you move ahead if you don't have private investment, especially if PPP is not coming on board to give it a little bit of a boost? This is just another visual, and this is the population above the age of 60, and Jordan has a very youthful population. It is among the youngest population in the world. Look where it is in terms of expenditure, almost 10% of GDP, and this is found in economies that have 20% old age population. In France now it's 1 to 5, one pensioner for every 5 contributors, right? So that's the 20% there. And look, Jordan is there. And then you look at pensions, and you see this, the bigger chunk is early retirement. Dr. Ibrahim mentioned on the PPP law and how it was reformed. If you look how many times the pension law has been reformed, the most recent a month ago, and JSF wrote about that, and it's not a reform to rationalize the pension expenditure. It was a reform to give away more. So there are a lot of things can be said, but somehow there is an inconsistency here of the fiscal dynamics vis-a-vis the measures that have been taken, and there have been many, and many of them are very well taken. Now, the private sector, everything goes down. This is total factor productivity. This is labor productivity going down. This is from the JSF. I hope I will get something from GSF for all the publicity I'm doing, right? And this is the complexity in this index of production. Production is becoming more basic and simpler. And this also explains why we have all this decline in total factor productivity. We're dealing with a small private sector whose dynamism has been declining. Now, whether it is because of economic, institutional, or other factors, it's another issue. We will expand this on the next version of the paper. And here is kind of a summary of the investment story. You see that total investment, capital formation, has decreased. The scales are different. So it went down from 30% to 16%. It was cut by half. And a lot of that has to do with the reduction in government expenditure. And there you have FDI. from 10% down to 1%. Now think about that. We're not doing the reforms in the last 3 years, and a key driver will be to attract foreign investment. Why has foreign investment not come into Jordan? And how credible the reforms are, and what is the expectation about continuing the same policies to attract foreign investors? So here we are a little bit in a bind. These are numbers. Now let's look at some qualitative dimensions of the private sector in the economy. Again, this is from GSF. It was a couple of weeks ago, and they summarized the findings of the Heritage Foundation Economic Freedom for Jordan. And even since 2019, they found that it has been declined. From 66 to 58 is a 10% decline. It's not a small one in 3 years. It declines every year by 3%. Let's probe a little bit to see what's happening here. And it's the obvious. Jordan is doing very well in monetary freedom. Of course, there is no capital controls, right? Interest rates are high for those who have deposits. It has a pegged currency, the Jordanian currency. So yes, from that side, at least now, things are okay. When you come now to taxes, it's a low tax economy, right? It is in the top third. It's 58 out of 183 countries. So respect to taxes, there are low taxes, okay? When you come to expenditures, you are in the middle with about 30% of GDP there, okay? So taking this together, I mean, this is the fiscal, if you want, part of the paper. What is a little bit of concern is the rule of law. And this one, taken together, the government size and the fiscal health is 163 out of the 183 countries. What are the 20 countries below? You can say you are 20 above, okay. But what are they? Burundi, right? Lebanon, Afghanistan, and all these things. So I don't know, Ms. Rin, we would like to know a little bit more about that, okay? But this is really the crux of the matter for our current purposes and for fiscal. Okay, so far we saw the fiscal, we saw the private sector. Let's start going to the social sectors. And this is what happened to wages over time in the last decade after the good years. And these are real wages in the private sector, stagnated. It's a compositional issue because we had no much productivity. And this is in the public sector. So the social contract is public sector employment, increasing wages, giving pensions. That's one side of it. What is the other side? The bottom of the labor, of employment distribution. Look what happened to minimum wages. And this is the real GDP. So this is what, on average, the Jordanians were getting, but the government was very concerned about the lowest here. So minimum wages increased by more than 200%, while GDP did not increase by more than 50%. This is relative in nominal terms, okay? So somehow this policy is a little bit bipolar. On the one hand, you have the public sector and pensions. On the other hand, you go down to minimum wage. By the way, these minimum wages are for Jordanians. The migrant workers are on a different scale. So there is something missing here, which is very important. And it's the middle class. And there are many in the middle class, right? I mean, poor are 15%, the poverty rate 20%. The rich are on their own. It's a big bulge in the population, and they are vocal. And poor don't have a voice, but the middle class is very vocal and dynamic. Before I go to the middle class, let me show you this one. Jordanians work. How much the work contributes an employment to GDP? That's the wage share in GDP. And it is one of the lowest. I don't have data for other countries, but this is from World Bank 2019. So the latest year perhaps is mid-2010s, but still, it's a very low share of wages to GDP. In OECD countries, about 60%. But anyway, 1/3 only of the wealth that Jordan produces in a year goes to workers. That's low. And now we come, is it because the workers are not productive? This is an ILO study and matched the surveys, education and occupation. And Jordan has the lowest share of underqualified workers in the labor force, in employment. And I'll come to that in a minute. So all these cries that there are, oh, they don't have the skills. The education system does not meet the needs of the private sector. Which private sector? Private sector that has no productivity, no value added. It's very well positioned with the migrants they have paying low wages. Or ask the average Jordanian, if he's in a company, what are the prospects for improvement? 90%, are in small enterprises, which is run by mom and pop. And who will become the manager? The son. So let's see this issue, not that skills cannot improve, not that the education system cannot improve, but let's not blame something where the causes are somewhere else. Now, let's come to the middle class. This is from the household survey, what they call it, household income and expenditure surveys in 2010 and 2017. But of course, the poor are poor, right? Their fate does not change much. They are subsistence, right? A little bit up, a little bit down. And they are only 20% of the population there. That's the poverty rate. The rich were 10%, the top quintile, if you want, 10% in 2010, 10% in 2017. Now, of course, you see a little bit of variation. These are samples. So you don't expect to have a very smooth line going one way or another. But look what's happened in the middle. So unemployment now has become not an issue of skills. It's an issue of class, of middle class. And the middle class are a little bit, as I said, vocal and many. And if you come to think about that, Tunisia and Egypt, before that in Ethiopia, as far as I know, even Iran, it was the middle class, right, that really got into the streets. The rich are okay, the poor are too poor to protest. They are too busy to make money for the day. Now, a little bit on the unemployment. Every document by the donor, every document by the government is the high unemployment rate of women, the high unemployment rate of the youth. Well, 70% of the unemployed are adults. It's easy to think about that. Why? Because they are from 25 to 60. There are 40 cohorts. The others are 15 to 24, and half of them are in the school. So even if all of them are unemployed, right, they will be fewer than the adults. So if you eliminate youth unemployment, assume you are still left with a big baby, 70%. It's a gender issue. Yes, it is. There are institutional factors and social factors that come into play, but there are 75% unemployed. The stock of unemployed is men and very few women. So eliminate all the women, you are left with 75. So it's structural. So surely it should be addressed, especially the youth for social reasons, right? And to avoid skilled immigration. That's something that is a result of the low skills that mechanically one can see in Jordan. But yeah, that's a big issue, whether, the economy, you include the shadow and the black economy and the like, right? But of course they are discouraged. Discouraged mean also, let's think of that. Women. Who are the women who work in developing countries? Those who need, the very poor, become cleaners. They become what you call domestics, and the very rich, okay? The educated, the doctors, the teachers, the ministers. We have a good sample here, right? And you are dealing again with the middle class. Look at the international experience. Jordan today is where Europe was in the 1950s. Women did not work then, and they had all the social constraints. When did they come in? When wages increased. It's a pull factor. You come up, think of Jordan, and there are papers on that. Does it pay for a woman to work if there is no transport, if there is no child care? And of course, think of the family. In a family, right, the man will have to work no matter what. The woman will be a little bit more selective, plus the fact that Jordan has very high amount of remittances. This creates an income effect. So even if you are just managing, your household as a woman gets money from the Gulf or from other countries. So you see one thing is to see the problem, the fact, and another thing is to see the truth. What is the truth behind this fact? So let me start, summing up what needs to be done and is being done, and credit should be given that everything is known. I have, and the ILO has summarized a lot of, and the World Bank, visions and strategies and plans. In fact, one vision was done under you, Ibrahim, when you were Minister of Planning. And then since 2008, in fairness, a lot of effort has been agreed between the Jordan and within Jordan and the international organizations. And we have 2019, the initiative, then the reform matrix, then the economic modernization vision, so on and so forth. So all is known. Nothing is new. In fact, I did a report for Jordan in '92. If I take that report on the social sectors and change the dates, it's still applicable today. And what is being done, granted, there were a lot of reforms envisaged originally, 258. During the course of the last 3 years, another 84 were added, either changing course or intensifying. And in total, we have 338 reforms. Now, if you have 338 reforms, there are some questions. Can you do it? That's one thing. Analytically, it says that the whole Jordan was in a problem. All aspects of governance, of electricity, of water, of financial, of banking, of investment, of all aspects of life. So really, we're dealing with somebody who could barely walk at the time, right? And then there is a challenge. Can you do it? Well, the latest published data are for 2021, and by then 131 reforms were introduced. Okay, we need to update that and see what reforms were delayed. And some of them, as I said, were delayed for good reasons, right? The COVID and the war in Ukraine. By the way, the IMF says that the COVID impact was not big from a fiscal perspective. Although they spent a lot, thousands of doctors and nurses and procurement took place, and it took a toll on lives and livelihoods, the fiscal impact was not big. How come? They have the answer. They slashed capital investment. So what we've been saying, you kick the cut. That's right. They introduce all these kinds of conditions on the private sector. Indeed. So this is what is happening, which can affect the speed, capacity, and implementation. Now, let's come to what we propose in the paper. It's in very broad terms. One is, it's 30 billion, the debt, it's high, but keep it, okay? Do not increase it, but keep it there. And think about that. You decrease the debt by 3%. How much is the government expenditure? 30. You are asking for cuts of 10% of government expenditure. Try to find them in the previous graph. Only 4% was capital, the rest was current. You cannot do it. Now, if you restrain it and you get 3% growth, right? Automatically you achieve the same as if you cut the public expenditures by 10%. But keep it at that level, but start doing expenditure switching. Move it away from pensions, for example, or other areas that are not that productive and put it in investment or on social protection, which is, NAF is very small. I don't know, it's something like 0.5% of GDP, something like that. Then, of course, you have the NEPCO and water issues. And what's coming up very quickly is climate adaptation expenditures. Now, when it comes to taxes, I was very glad talking to our colleagues from the UN here and the joint paper they put in EcoShock. And they have there a discussion. We have not included it on property taxes. I mean, property taxes are easy, cheap administrative. You can see what it is, right? And it's very low in Jordan. I don't know the reasons for that, land registration, or perhaps the landlords and those who have property owner have a lot of influence in the high authorities, but it's 0.005% of GDP. In Morocco, it's about 3 times higher. And we know that property taxes are distortionary. If you tax production, you tax employment, you tax output, you tax everything. Why? Because you tax upstream and cascade. Property taxes are there. The impact is not distortionary. It doesn't change the relative prices in the economy. And then you have to, we don't go in very great detail, accelerate private sector-led growth and employment creation, reduce the public-private employment duality, and address unemployment as a real issue, not as a politically correct issue, that it is, say, just gender. It is gender, but not all of it. And the youth, yes, it's a social issue, but don't address it as a giveaway. So that's all I have to say. But yesterday actually, and last night, I got 2 things in my inbox. One is, guess from where? Again, from the JSF, right? This is it. This is very disheartening, right? This is the component of the Freedom Index that deals with, look, where am I? Oh, sorry, I skipped a slide. Okay, let me go to that. So yesterday I got this one, which is on the rule of law. And it has declined again significantly. Now, the component, this rule of law has 8 components. And the component on economic criminal justice has gone down. The component of civil justice has gone down. The component of corruption has gone down. Civil justice, open government, government power, and fundamental rights all have gone down. 7 of them. One of them was stable, rule of law, which was order and security, which is good. Okay. Now, sorry, let me go back to the issue of projecting. Okay, let me go to the last one and then come back to this. And this also came yesterday in the announcement by the World Bank of their annual meetings that they start in 10 days. And they said, we have rising interest rates. Jordan knows that, at least because the JD is pegged to the dollar and follows effectively the monetary policy of the United States, with due respect to those here who are familiar with the central bank. And they say that the rising interest rates are going to push more countries into a crisis. And this, of course, has been accelerated by the past 3 years, but what we'll see is that countries will have a big problem since they have reached a 50-year high of debt to GDP ratio, which is more or less the case in Jordan. Okay, this is general. We'll have to think now about the implications for the for Jordan. Now, let's go to the last slide, which is effectively the first title, fiscal sustainability. So far, I dealt with the subtitle, the private sector and social sectors. Let's go back and conclude on this one. Okay, these are, we have a model, Ishaq has a model, and the lab has a model to do a lot of simulations, which we were planning to do, we haven't finished them. But going by what we've read, mainly from the IMF. Of course, the IMF projections are optimistic. In fact, in my long history with development economics, I can't think of projections that were not optimistic. Why? If you put something that you think it's more real and pessimistic, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Assume for foreign direct investment, the IMF has said it's not sustainable. Would anybody come to Jordan? So you always go higher, and then you start adjusting, and you can find a lot of excuses. That's what is economic. You make a projection today about the future, and then later you say why these projections did not materialize. So it is optimistic by 2027, which is already 2 years later than expected, but for good reason. And it is subject to a lot of assumptions there. And something to know technically is the critical assumption is the interest rate, assuming you control the level of debt and you don't borrow more. It's the interest rate and the rate of increase in GDP. These are the two critical parameters. If you get them right, then everything depends on whether the government spends more, which is under control of the government. But the interest rate and the growth of the private sector is a rabbit in a hat. Will this time be different? Well, in the past, Jordan has what we say there, checkered kind of record. It's stop-go. You introduce something, as things get a little bit better, you postpone. And now it seems at least the number of reforms that have been adopted, introduced, is high, and the machinery is working. Now, how much of it has been implemented, we don't know. And how much of this will continue without policy reversals. We had two examples today, the PPP and the pension law already. So the key challenge remains to assess what would the balance between austerity measures vis-a-vis economic growth be according to the current policies. Now, from experience, we know that the turnaround of the private sector is very slow. You don't turn a speedboat within a port. It's a tanker. In order to get somewhere, you need a lot of time and effort to move this tanker. And also the other question is the reaction of the citizens. Now, a lot of emphasis is on the primary surplus. And let me close with this point. And Adnan can tell us more perhaps about it. The relationship between the primary surplus and debt reduction is not that strong if you are in a high indebted economy. And in fact, it was an IMF paper almost 10 years ago that said, you go for growth. Forget the primary surplus of the budget. Primary surplus of the budget is domestic revenues and expenditure, excluding the interest, which is already agreed and had to be paid. But at least you should balance your domestic expenditure and in fact have positive balance, so you can start repaying the debt. But another kind of discomforting factor is not only that the private sector takes time to turn around, but the relationship between primary debt, that is a key focus of the IMF, and eventually debt sustainability is not that clear empirically. Now, Jordan can be different, and we hope it will. So let me stop here. I think I overshot. Yes, we had an hour, I think, for the presentation. So I earned my salary, yeah? Well, thank you very much. Thank you. Nisreen, you're moderating.
Thank you so much, Zaviris. I don't think anyone would been able to put the story of Jordan in the way that you, Zaviris, were able to put it. It's a gloomy story. But we have to face the facts. And what you have mentioned is really the evidence and the facts which we need to face. And accordingly, we need to find our way out. So maybe some challenges would be good if we looked at them from the perspective of opportunities to change. And I think this is maybe what we need perhaps to focus, taking into consideration the bold facts that you have mentioned and the beautiful analysis and connection between the various variables. We have two commenters on the paper, Dr. Mary Qawar. Dr. Mary Qawar she holds a PhD from London School of Economics. Previously, she was the Minister of Planning and International Cooperation, and before that, she was a director at the ILO for West Africa. Her expertise is in labor, social protection, gender, among many other things. We look forward to hear your comments, Mary. I think you have like 20 minutes.
Thank you very much, نسرين. صباح الخير جميعاً. سعيدة بوجودي معكم اليوم وبشكر من المنتدى لدعوتي. راح يعني الكومنتس اللي عملتها باللغة الإنجليزية على الورقة، فهلا راح أنقل للغة الإنجليزية. Okay. Thank you for this presentation, Zafiris, Brahim, and Lay. And I would like to start by stating the high relevance of this paper to Jordan for several reasons. And mainly that the debt to GDP ratio has been increasing over time, while expenditures on social sectors have remained the same or declined, apart from pensions and public sector wages, that is. At the same time, the private sector has been growing slowly, and it has been also, as Zafira said, a jobless growth. So these issues go to the heart of the political economy in Jordan, including stability and social peace. So the paper rightly goes beyond the kind of fiscal accounting approach and takes a more holistic view of Jordan's development paradigm, and more explicitly includes the social sectors and the labor market. So I would like to congratulate the authors with the full disclosure of my part that I know Brahim for many years, and I am connected also to Zafiris. So before proceeding, actually, I would like to share some of my personal experiences as Minister of Planning and International Cooperation and how it relates to this paper. So my role in 2008 was to get for Jordan as much as I could in terms of external support, in terms of grants and soft loans. I mean, that's the role of the Minister of Planning and International Cooperation. At the time, the public deficit and debt had reached unsustainable levels, and we had reached a fiscal cliff. You all remember 2018, 2019. And of course, there were social concerns. Getting such support required commitment to address many structural issues. So we organized with the UK government is still in line. So after this long introduction about my time at the ministry, I will actually go back to the paper. So the paper reflects well the history and the crisis in the 1980s. It's optimistic that Jordan will avoid the crisis of the late 1980s. It was able to. That was associated with it was, though, associated with a very sharp devaluation. The IMF, Jordan's central bank at the time, were aware of the benefits of keeping the Jordanian dinar pegged to the dollar. So the paper is optimistic, though adequately qualified about the future, and recognizes the uphill battle Jordan is faced with. I agree with the issue that debt sustainability remains despite the significant step taken since 2019. To start showing results. So we can say that we have a clear vision of what needs to be done, but to actually implement it and start seeing impact takes quite some time. And all this assumes that there will be no more external shocks. I mean, who knew that after COVID, we will have another external shock, which is the Ukrainian. Okay, an observation of the paper is that debt burden in Jordan started declining very fast during the period of high economic growth of the 2000s. From this, the authors rightly point to the need to revive growth as the sure way to reduce debt to GDP ratio. So in fact, there aren't many cases where stabilization and recovery have gone according to plan. So beyond the fiscal accounting underlying sustainability, one has to examine better what's happening in the real sectors and what are the prospects for the real economy to quickly be restructured and for the private sector to rebound. The difficult thing for Jordan is that the private sector, as Zafiris told us, starts from a very low base to leverage a whole economy. Something that can lead to employment growth and an improvement in household incomes. So all in all, social acceptability of reforms would depend not only on the current levels of satisfaction of the citizens with the services, and their satisfaction with them has been declining over time. And as Dr. Ibrahim talked about the issue of trust and social contract, as well as Zafiris both mentioned these issues. In another recent ERF paper, the provision by the government of education and health services has been declining, together with the quality and outcomes of these services. In fact, it is not just the current satisfaction of citizens with the current state of social services that will determine the acceptability of reforms, but also their expectations. This includes the prospect of the criteria under which pensions are granted that will have to become tighter in the future if we are going to see any changes. And the paper pays a lot of attention to the already high pension outlays and their almost explosive dynamics. In the meantime, apart from pensions, health, and education, there are other issues that have emerged, as has been rightly mentioned also by Zafiris, such as energy and water sectors, including the large debt of NEPCO. And in the near future, climate adaptation, which we need to start addressing. Today, for example, the private sector suffers from high energy prices, while NEPCO is still in debt. So Dr. Ibrahim, the former Minister of Energy, can give us more information about this. But it is an example whereby reducing debt and unleashing potential of the private sector and improving livelihoods come head to head. I very much appreciated how the paper linked debt sustainability to the labor market. It does so not just by stressing the need for economic growth, but also by changing the nature of growth, employment, and wages. Yes, Jordan faces serious unemployment challenge, but a more challenging issue is to address the low economic growth rates that in turn affect wages and the willingness of citizens to work, something that applies specifically also to the reserve army of women, as was mentioned in the paper. Now, women's low participation rate in the labor market is in some part due to social reasons or family responsibilities and the lack of family-friendly policies in terms of transport and childcare. But the fact is that the economy, that is the private sector, is not producing decent jobs at a high enough wages to attract women in the labor market. I mean, it's as simple as that. This is also a reason why employment share of migrant workers has been increasing over time. And Jordan must reverse the trend towards low value added, low productivity activities. And however, both public and private and FDI, and improvements in the rule of law and economic freedom, as the presentation rightly showed us. In addition to gender issues, the other two observations mentioned in the paper about the labor market are also convincing. The case of youth unemployment is in line with common sense for two reasons. From a numerical point of view, the number of youth is as many as there is in the cohorts 15-24 compared to the other generations. And the majority of them are in education. So the size of the youth labor force is small, and a small number of them are actually unemployed because a lot of them are in education and training. And it is a fact that always the first job of a young person takes the longest. So unemployment at the beginning of your life is almost natural. So other labor market issues in the paper is the high rates of skilled immigration. Again, from a numerical point of view, if the educated and skilled immigrate, then there are few of them available locally. But again, from an analytical point of view, one wonders why wages are low and declining among the more educated, while the private sector increasingly employs less educated migrant workers. Moreover, skilled immigration suggests that Jordanians have skills that enable them to work anywhere in the world. Having said this, it is also true that the education system is declining and it needs to improve to be able to recover and ensure that we have skilled labor force for a future labor market. Now, moving to the issue of social protection, last year I worked on a paper on social protection for the ERF with other colleagues, and also noted the limited funds available for social assistance given the high and increasing spending on pensions, which raises issue both of fiscal sustainability and also equity and poverty and freedom. So expenditures on the National Aid Fund have not increased, and this is the vulnerable and the poor, but expenditures on pensions and wages of the public sector is constantly increasing. The lowest 20% of households received practically no pensions in Jordan, while the top 20% received nearly half of the total pension bill. I mean, think about it for a moment, and in terms of equality. That paper also argued that public sector employment and pensions have made has become a de facto social protection mechanism. This also says something about the nature of the social contract. So most of the expenditures are on pensions, and it's a de facto social protection rather than looking at who needs it the most. The graph Zafiris showed that unemployment is increasingly becoming a middle-class phenomena is very concerning. The old social contract has delivered social peace in the past, but it will need to be adjusted to the new economic reality, anticipating the impacts that may arise from any adjustments and austerity programs. So let me move now to the conclusion. The paper scope goes beyond the narrow consideration of fiscal adjustment based on fiscal accounting that typically prescribes cutting expenditures and increasing revenues. In addition, its rich analytics provided a depth of information on the topic. The paper proposes to be careful with expenditure cuts, but is very vocal about the need to have expenditure switches towards more investment and therefore growth and job creation, lower pension spending and therefore more equality for those who need it most, and more funds for the vulnerable and the poor. So that sustainability at the end is a development issue in the first place, with the fiscal fundamental and important component of that. And this is how we need to look at the topic, and the paper succeeded in doing that. Now, I have to say what could be improved in the paper. The paper is already long, but perhaps some issues can be addressed maybe in another paper. For example, one issue I would like to see examined sooner rather than later, actually, the interplay between the interest rates and government borrowing from a debt stabilization perspective against the stability of the domestic financial and banking sectors. The last slide of the presentation, quoting the World Bank, alerted us about the rise of interest rate, and this is perhaps something, of course, that the Jordan Central Bank is focusing on. Lastly, and talking about the presentations, I felt the presentation was clearer and more succinct than the paper. The paper was very long and heavy to read. So some editing is due, but also maybe some updating of numbers, and more importantly, what happened since 2021, which is the end of the year of the paper. So not so much about the numbers are still, we know that projections are still preliminary at this stage, but it would be nice to have more recent and projection level information. Again, thank you for giving me this opportunity to comment on this very rich paper. And again, I would like to thank and congratulate the authors. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Mary. I agree with you with the additions and the perhaps changes that need to be looked into the paper. I think the flow of the presentation was more informative and focused because of the virus. At this stage, I would like to ask Dr. Adnan Mazrouei to give his comments also to the authors of the paper. Dr. Adnan, he is a non-resident senior fellow at Peterson Institute for International Economics. Previously, he was a deputy director at the IMF, where he worked on resolving various financial crises in emerging markets, including the 1998 Russian financial crisis. Dr. Adnan helped to manage the IMF strategy and global coordination of the support of the Arab Spring. He holds a PhD in economics from the University of California. So Dr. Adnan, the virus asked a question, why IMF are optimists always, and maybe in some studies there was also a question that maybe restructuring programs were able to create stability somehow, but not growth. We would like at this point to hear your comments on the paper, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you. I think this is a very nice paper. I like the fact that it puts so much emphasis on improving growth. Okay. Having said this, I think then I would reverse the presentation and start with a discussion of debt sustainability. because it is that picture that will need to be the basis and for a call to action by the authorities and others about dealing with debt. Debt is high, 110, 114% of GDP. Interest rates are rising, and the differential between interest rates and growth is already negative. If I understand correctly, nominal interest rates are 7%. And the primary surplus before measures are negative. And debt sustainability requires increasing primary surpluses over time. Of course, I'm going by the IMF's most recent projections. Zafiris has rightly mentioned that interest rates will be under pressure to go up because of the global fight against inflation, causing also a dollar appreciation. I think the paper also needs to be more clear whether the debt is sustainable or not. The paper equivocates somehow as it moves back and forth in this, indicating whether that the debt is sustainable and versus it's not. The next issue is growth financing needs. In other words, liquidity issues. Even if the trajectory of debt may be improving with some measures, growth financing needs are very high. According to the IMF, for 2023, the projection has been for 23% of GDP. The financing outlook also, in my opinion, needs to stress that geopolitics that have helped Jordan for many years are becoming less favorable. Especially the GCC donors have become more cautious about providing assistance, not to Jordan, but to everyone. They're asking for more reforms upfront. This is true, for example, with regard to their assistance to Egypt and to Pakistan, for example. Also, I think, I don't necessarily suggest you go into it, but be aware that debt restructuring is becoming more and more difficult given the weaknesses in the international financial architecture becoming more and more apparent, especially because of the role of China. Furthermore, in connection with geopolitics, one thing that has helped Jordan for some years has been the fact that the US government has provided guarantees to Eurobonds issued by Jordan, which may or may not continue in the future. The paper also needs to be a little bit more careful in distinguishing between implicit versus contingent liabilities regarding to Social Security. Okay. Those liabilities are there, but because of any possible miscalculation, the contingent liabilities may be higher than what are already assumed. The paper goes through a number of ways that the growth has to improve, and I fully agree with the agenda. My own experience with Jordan for many, many years, starting in 94 or 5, has been that policies to encourage growth, very frankly, have never been very serious. And in the minds of the authorities, as in many in the region, has been the view that the geopolitical safety net will always be there. But the geopolitics are changing very much. One issue that Zafiris rightly mentioned has been the regulatory framework and the rule of law. I think these are areas that really need to be expanded. My own experience is that the regulatory problems have not only affected the ability to promote growth, but also to deal with macroeconomic shocks. Here I have in mind the entry barriers in the energy sector that had prevented smooth adjustment to the cutoff, let's say, in Egyptian gas several years ago. One other angle that I think needs to be looked at is the issue of competitiveness. In recent years, just past couple of years, the real effective exchange rate of the Jordanian dinar has depreciated since the pandemic. It is very difficult for the authorities to consider whether there is a need to change the exchange rate regime. It is almost sacrosanct, but it is time to consider the costs. It has helped anchor inflation. It has helped anchor financial stability. But frankly, over many years, it has implied a decreasing competitiveness. In this connection, when I was at IMF, we considered the scope for internal devaluations as ways of cutting the cost of labor, but we never went very far. Now, it is very true that the IMF's growth projections for many, many countries are way too optimistic. The fund has a conflict of interest on this issue, especially in the case of countries which have programs. Our mission chiefs, when they project growth, it's not just a projection of growth, it's a projection of the success of the programs they put together. Secondly, these are growth rates that are discussed and negotiated with authorities. And that is never an easy task. Now, Zafiris also rightly mentioned that some of the structural reforms that he and his colleagues have considered will take a lot of time. I am therefore pessimistic. First, that the adequate reforms will be done. Second, they will be done in time. And unfortunately, we will be back in the position of having to reconsider expenditure cuts with the attendant social and political implications that Zafiris and his colleagues have rightly emphasized. But unfortunately, I have a pessimistic view of developments in this area. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Adnan, for the valuable comments as well. So Dr. Adnan was mentioning that perhaps also some reverse in how to tell the story, the case of Jordan, in the flow of it need to be looked at. He believes that perhaps we need, in the paper, you need to answer the question about the debt sustainability. Also, he mentioned about the policies to encourage growth were not seriously implemented. And actually, the paper which we published, JSF, yesterday, it showed that in the rule of law, government was, or the Jordan rank was really dropping when it comes to open government, constraints on government power and fundamental rights, which means that maybe reforms are not taken seriously in some cases. Also, the issue of competitiveness, it's a debatable issue, perhaps, that would require some discussion. Now, given the challenges that face the Jordanian economy, and one should not be surprised to learn that a majority of the population, 63%, consider the current state of the economy as the biggest challenge facing the country, according to the Arab Barometer of 2022. In addition, the Arab Barometer notes that trust in the government has been declining. Indeed, while 73.4% of the population trusted the government in 2011 survey, this proportion has fallen to 65.5% in 2013, 54% in 2016, down to 32.2% in 2022. From the outset, the paper makes it clear that any future measures to reduce the debt burden without, I would like to go back summarizing perhaps the paper to open the discussion. So it has made it clear that any future measures to reduce the debt burden without realizing healthy economic growth would fail and result in the adoption of fiscal austerity measures. In addition, the paper rests on the argument that the adoption of any sufficient austerity measures would have serious consequences to the socioeconomic challenges facing Jordan. This is why, in terms of the policy implication, the paper argues that the objective should be to prevent debt from rising further while continuously and consistently implementing measures that would, in the first hand, increase the competitiveness of the private sector and reduce the segregation in the labor market, public versus private, employment and benefits, male versus female workers, nationals versus non-Jordanians. Second, rationalize expenditure in a way that would reduce not only the shortcome, but also the future implicit liability, especially pensions. When we say that around 10% of is going to the pension with a young population, this is really alarming. While addressing social issues valued by citizens that have shown a deteriorating tendency, such as education, health, transport, housing, and water, among others. And thirdly, increase revenue collection while rebalancing the tax structure, moving away from taxing production. And they gave us the example of the low property tax rate as a clear example. I would like to open the discussion at this point, whether you have any question for the authors or perhaps our lead commenters. Yeah. Dr. Ghassan.
يعني in principle, I liked and I enjoyed reading the paper. But as the last commentator stated, I would like to refer to a published paper by the IMF, July, I think, 2022. In it, there is some decent optimistic debt sustainability analysis, I think it can be revamped the Jordanian way, and some good results will come out of it. And the framework or the econometric methodology is well explained in the paper. That's one observation. The other observation that I like to raise is that the wage share in the Jordanian economy is relatively low, as was stated by Zaviris. It's about 34, 36, 35%. We're very similar to the Gulf oil exporting countries. Yani, it's not surprising that the wage share in the Gulf is low, but it's very shocking that it is low in Jordan. Mahu, the rest, Zaviris is operating surplus. If the rest is the operating surplus, it's the private sector's profit, as it were. Because they haven't been investing, so it means they've been retaining a lot of their wealth. A very typical example, if you look at Jordan Phosphate, Jordan Potash, look at their cash reserves, look at their retained earnings, look at their equity capital, it is huge, but they're not reinvesting. So maybe my educated guess, the Jordanian economy has been suffering for too long. Never mind the impact of the rules and regulations and the reforms. It might have been suffering from what is called financialization. The private sector is making profits, but they're not investing. Yani, just an idea. Who's been getting larger in assets, in sales, in employment? Hospitals, universities, and schools. And nobody else. Nobody else. Maybe the private sector is happy. I don't know. But then I can't take it for granted always government reforms, government regulations are only the obstacle. I don't know. I think the public sector and the leaders of the private sector need to sit together and ask this question. Why isn't the private sector growing? Yani Royal Jordanian was established long time ago, before I was born. It was much bigger than Turkish Airlines and Qatari Airlines and Dubai and United Arab Emirates. It used to be called Alia, now it's Royal Jordanian. It's got something like 18, 20, maybe 22 aircrafts. As our friends say, Jesus Christ, 20 aircrafts in 2023. Mahu, they used to be 20, 22 aircrafts back in 1990. So it shrank in real terms. It hasn't expanded. I don't know the answer. I think management needs to tell us the answer. I'm getting really emotional with what I'm saying. Nobody's getting bigger.
Thank you, Dr. Ghassan. I have actually a question, if I may, since I'm taking the mic here. For the pension in specific, this number that we see in the budget, it reflects the military pension mostly. The civil pension is less than 3% of that number. Why? Because since 1996, all civil, they shifted to the Social Security Corporation. So by now, most of the civil are really ventures as part of the Social Security Corporation. Now, why I'm saying that? Because as of 2023, we will start seeing drop in the percent of the pension, because in military, they start to retire after 20 years of service, and they were shifted to the Social Security in 2006, in 2003. So by 2023, the first row of pensioners will start getting their pension from the Social Security. And that's why actually they were in a rush to do the changes that we witnessed lately on the law. So my question is that this huge number which we are seeing now and feeling that it is too much, I'm telling you, my guess, my educated guess, as my friend says always, tells me we will see this number decreasing. So the question is that switching expenditure here or reutilizing the amount for more of a productive spending needs to be looked at, or perhaps I would wish if the paper look into this specific issue and start highlighting, alarming policymakers about it. Any other question before giving back to Zaviris?
The actuarial analysis and on making this projections because this number would or should be reflected in the social security projections and their actuarial analysis. I know, I am aware of this because they were retired at 16 in the military. However, even the sustainability of the social security, it depends on the actuarial. We are witnessing now crisis in, the engineering fund, the lawyers fund. They are witnessing issues related to the sustainability because of, being generous today means you're poor in the future. But if we can access just to, as an immediate reaction to this, if we can access to this analysis, then this would be part of this analysis and the model that we're hopefully to conduct.
Ibrahim.
دكتور إبراهيم تفضل. ميوتد دكتور إبراهيم. دكتور إبراهيم عم تسمعنا؟ تفضل. بدك تيميل unmute دكتور.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Nasreen. Thank you very much. I myself also enjoyed the presentation and I had a chance to skim through the paper. It's really a tour de force, as they say, of the issues concerned to Jordan. I have one actually point to raise, which is that one of the key recommendations, which is taken, of course, upfront by the paper of the regional report, that austerity without growth is a futile exercise. But the question, which obviously the paper, has taken this idea on board, but the question is, what are the most critical constraints that needs to be taken care of in the short to medium run in order to ignite growth and providing a space for the institutional reforms and the more longer term type of reforms to take its course. This does not come very clear in the paper, in the sense that the paper provides an overall assessment and review of the various constraints and issues, but in terms of short versus long run, policy growth strategies, I think perhaps maybe you might want to consider this much more explicitly. And I have a question for Adnan, and I share with him the importance of competitiveness and the exchange rate. But more recently, many scholars have been questioning the potential of export-led growth in the digitech economy, and that perhaps maybe growth could be had in other ways, perhaps maybe domestic demand or whatever. But in the case of Jordan, do you think that tradable services might actually be a source of competitiveness and growth should the political economy allows more flexibility in terms of the adopted exchange rate regime? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Adnan.
Sure. Look, you're absolutely right. There is a debate about external versus internal orientation. The peculiar part of issue about Jordan is that the size of the domestic market is very limited. Okay. For years, as you rightly indicated, Jordan was the provider of relatively higher value added services to the region, be it education or health. Okay. Over the years, Jordan seems to have lost its competitive advantage, where with countries such as the UAE, Turkey, offering more attractive services, let's say in medicine. Okay. Countries that do have, okay, in area service comparative advantage could lose it. The most notorious example in my mind is Lebanon, which used to have much higher comparative advantage in the provision of education for the region. That is all gone now. Okay. Unfortunately, there may be some room for knowledge-based digital economy growth, but I think, as was said, investment in Jordan, although corporations are making good profits, is not happening. And it is really, that is the concern. And maybe I don't know enough about Jordan, but I've always felt it's a question of governance, and two, geopolitics and uncertainty about geopolitics, which has prevented that. Now, domestic governance could be improved. I am not optimistic about the geopolitics of the region improving. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Adnan. Before going back to the authors, there's another question in the back, please.
Thank you. My name is Bashar Zaytoun. I have a few comments about climate change, but before I do so, the words of is it Dr. Ghassan brought to me a question, and that is, how much R&D spending does the private sector make, and whether this can be a source of long-term economic growth, talking about investments and so. Going back to climate change, so there were a few times when climate change was mentioned today, and I'm not sure if the paper goes into any more details, but just to have a few thoughts, and it would be great if the next editions of the paper can address this. I'm not sure if the paper is or can build a scenario where it shows how much climate change how much loss in GDP will be caused by climate change in the next 10, 20 years. The other, another comment, people spoke about spending on climate adaptation. It's coming up soon. And I'm not sure if this people are referring to additional spending on climate change. And there are two points to be made here. Adaptation is about development anyway. So it's not, yes, there are some adaptation projects that need to be new, need to be additional, but another approach is to view this as reallocating spending on adaptation rather than climate unfriendly projects right now in the agriculture or water sector. These can be reallocated into climate friendly projects. So we're not talking about additional funding, we're just talking about reallocation of funding from maladaptation projects into climate adaptation projects. And my final comment is, we need to spend more time, I would argue, to frame climate change action as a job creator. And there are lots and lots that can be said on this and done. And perhaps as I said, future editions can look into this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bashar. I would like just to comment on what you have said. First, Jordan Strategy Forum actually is aware of the environment and its opportunity to create jobs. And that's why we started a series of work in that direction to highlight and understand better that opportunity. But also I would like to mention that when it comes to environment and the whole region, the MENA region is missing out investment, impact investment, trillions of dollars in impact investment. The MENA region share out of these trillions is less than 1%. And that is also that we are missing out when it comes to foreign direct investment with that regard. But anyway, I will leave Dr. Zaviris and perhaps first Dr. Ghassan, if you would like to reflect. There was a comment. Yes, Yazan.
Just one last question, and please forgive my ignorance. I'm a PFM advisor, and I work a lot with numbers. And I find it very difficult here in Jordan to get the data. So my question, when we're referring to such paper, it's magnificent. Really, the way you look at things from different angles tells you a different story. But and I'll give you an example of what we're facing. The source of information first, and the source of definition. We're finding a lot of problems with getting that, or if I want to analyze a certain activity, for instance, by the source of information and the source of definition, I can get two different description to the activity itself and solutions as well. I'll give you one example about debt, and we're talking about the public debt. Now the ratio that is the ceiling for any debt in Jordan is the GDP to debt ratio. And when we're talking about the debt, we're talking about gross debt, and the definition of gross debt is related to the IMF GFSM manuals. And even when you define that according to these manuals, there's a lot of gray areas. So by definition, you can shrink your debt or increase your debt, especially with guaranteed debt. And it depends on how you support your argument. For instance, we took, with our work, we took the same inputs and we came up with a different output of how that ratio is. But the definition and the source of information are really can give a lot of, let's say, variance between this study and that study. So what kind of information can we refer to, and it will be the base of our analysis? This is my question.
Okay, thank you so much. So maybe let me, please, Dr. Tahani.
Good afternoon, and thank you so much for this insightful presentation. My question for Dr. Adnan, do you think that sometimes in Jordan, we depend a lot on the donors, and we think that it is the efficient policy to manage our debt sustainability? And from your technical expertise, do you recommend that sometimes developing countries have to take a break from those financial assistance in order to manage the governance climate inside each country? Because the more we have financial assistance, the more we think we are in a safe place, and we couldn't have our own capacity building in terms of managing the domestic bureaucratic public disparities in the system, in the Jordanian system. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Dr. Tahani. We then go back to the authors, starting by if Dr. Ibrahim, if you would like to have any comment, and then we move to Dr. There is a question for okay, perfect. Dr. Adnan, would you like to respond to Dr. Tahani's question?
Look, it is very true that some countries get addicted to assistance, and assistance becomes a security blanket. Unfortunately, geopolitics sometimes doesn't go the way we expected it to, and different countries' geopolitical significance changes. Jordan is not the only one. For me, the prime example is Pakistan. There used to be a time Pakistan in the global geopolitical picture was much more important. It could count on a lot more. Now it can't. Okay. Of course, it is not easy to say, in order to get our house in order, let us not accept any aid, because then in the short term, you would get into much more difficult issues. There were two other comments that were made. One was about the definition of debt. My strong suggestion is not to get into changing definitions. That is the easiest way to lose credibility about what your situation is, and especially with regard to private lenders, in the international lenders. Also, there was a question about R&D. The latest World Bank information is for Jordan is 2016, and R&D was 0.7% of GDP. By way of comparison, China data are for 2020, and it was 2.4% of GDP. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Adnan. Yeah.
Okay, so, well, first to thank the two peer reviewers and the moderator for summarizing and organizing the whole thing, and also the participants for their comments. Let me start with the last one on the dearth of statistics. I mean, we have two ministers of planning here. Did you ever manage to get micro data from those? Did you ever manage? You are the ministers. The director is under. Did you manage to get? You managed. Okay. Because they say, tell us what you want and we'll send it to you. We'll send the tabulation. I remember it must have been when I was manager in the World Bank of the MENA region, and I organized a capacity building workshop for all the statisticians in the MENA region. And the then director of DOS, if I remember the name correctly, was Ibrahim Shihata, very nice man and the like, and he said something that really stuck me. He said, in my country, I'm stronger than the prime minister. No matter who asks me for data, I can say no. If anybody from high authorities asks the prime minister to do something, he has to do it. By law, I'm not obliged to give away any data. So, yes, yes. So we are a little bit like my country, Greece, right? That the unemployment data were a state secret for 3 years, right? And if they were accurate. So yes, I mean, this is an issue, go back to the definitional issues that Adnan was mentioning. And that's why we are using indices. Because if you go by the levels and the changes, things will be different. While no matter whether you use the total or gross or central government debt, there is collinearity there. The indices, the trends are the same, more or less, because even the contingent or implicit liability of the pension fund is changing very little over time. So whether you include it or you exclude it, the bulk of the change is determined by the amount of current borrowing, if you want. On the point you mentioned on the climate adaptation, the IMF now has come with a very elaborate model that takes into account the impacts of climate adaptation expenditures. And I think they have estimated that if Jordan moves ahead by 2027 with whatever it has to do, in the short run, this will deteriorate the situation by something like 1.5% of GDP. That was a paper on new guidelines for staff. And I don't know, Dr. Adnan can give us the exact reference on that for the staff, but it is in the Article 4 consultations of the IMF of July 2022, the exact calculations, what the debt will be with climate adaptation measures and without. Going back to other comments, I learned a new term, which I love, and I'm going to use the geopolitical safety net, right? I mean, this is really something, not the social safety net, which means, collected the rent, right? I mean, somehow Erdogan is playing the same with the refugees, the Syrian refugees there. He threatens Europe, right? Unless you're good to me, right? I will send them to you, right? Via Greece or other measures. And it's true what Adnan said, that yes, as of now, I mean, Jordan is the only country holding into the West in the region. There is Syria, right? There is Iraq. There is Lebanon and Palestine. I don't know what will happen with Saudi and China and the new things, and whether any support from Saudi will be conditional on some kind of entry point from China, who last year, China gave 40 billion in assistance, and the IMF gave 65 billion. So the international lender at this point is becoming China. In 2000, China had zero external aid, providing zero external aid. Now it's 40 billion, and the IMF was 60 or 65. But you can see now the rise in China, and its influence now even with Iran. So if somehow, let me go off script, if Jordan disappears, I mean, of this geopolitical game, Iran with the Shiites in Lebanon, I mean, will make a real axis there. But that's a bit of the script. Now, on the wage share, yes, it is true, it's very low in the Gulf, but this excludes the rent, the oil rent. If you take out the oil rent, the civil service salaries there make Jordan, I mean, look a champion. I mean, real healthy in this respect. The common thread, and I don't know how we can go about it, I mean, we all know the issues, but I will go 30 years ago, in 1992, when I first came to Jordan. And the Minister of Planning that I met, it was assistance to the returnees, right? And the shock that the country was going, the impact of the IMF was really at the time the old IMF, right? So the good guys came, the poverty reduction from the World Bank, I mean, to cushion the cost of adjustment. And I remember the briefing book I got from Washington in the dialogue with the government had a red line there. don't raise the issue of the peg. Lo and behold, Dr. Ziad Fares was governor, right? Up until a year or two ago, it's the same rate, 141, right? So this is something that has benefits, but as the peer reviewer suggested, I mean, it affects competitiveness. And we know that if anything goes wrong there, the banking sectors and all the deposits that are there will be affected. Yeah, the banking sector, how healthy it is. I mean, I remember, up until 2 or 3 years ago, the interest rate on the dollar was 0, right? And the domestic banks were offering 3% or something. So every year they were making a loss. I mean, in what they were paying. So I don't know how far our Ibrahim, we can go on this line. I mean, we can address it, and it is addressed actually in the IMF, and we can mention it. But in terms of policy recommendation, I don't know how far we can go. Definitely, we'll have some enrichments and a lot of comments that you have said. Perhaps textbooks on policy reversals and delays beyond the ones that were necessary. This would require some institutional investigation. We can have a textbook on, or a section on the pensions to address it a little bit more squarely. What we have now are the general kind of areas, and we can go deeper into them. And one thing, we have it in the paper, but just to mention it as a final point, what we have is that inequality in education opportunity in Jordan is extremely high. In other countries, to be born poor is not as much of a destiny in the education outcomes as the case has become in Jordan. And it was mentioned by the peer reviewer that health has services and competitiveness has gone down. And together with that, there's an inequality in incomes, the interquintile differences, that is the difference between the top 20% and the bottom 20% is very high. And we say in the paper that the differences in education attainment between rich and poor and the level of inequality in Jordan has reached the level of Latin America, of countries in Latin America. So here you have a country that in the 80s, even 90s, was kind of socially coherent. And I remember it. I mean, in the 90s when I came, even the counterparts I was meeting, right, from secretary generals and ministers and others, they were sending their kids to public education. And there was no issue. In fact, one member of my team broke his arm in the Intercontinental. It was slippery and broke his arm. And the level of surgeries, I mean, Jordan was doing open heart surgeries there, right? Which does today, but things are moving the private sphere somehow, which is okay as long as there is a provision also for those who cannot. I mean, you see what's happening in America. I mean, the difference between now this week, 15 million Americans will get off insurance because they were covered with the COVID emergency, and these are the poorest. So this is very concerning, I mean, for a small country where coherence is so important, and we can see that in the history. So with that one, and of course what you mentioned, Dr. Nisrin, the barometer is a linear decline from 7% to 35. I mean, this is 32. So let me stop here and thanks everybody for their comments, and we look to the next comments, next version, and any additional input you can share with us. Thank you.
I don't know if Dr. Ibrahim, you have any final comment before I thank our speakers and our authors.
Very, very quickly. Some of the issues that even Dr. Adnan, of course, I reiterate my appreciation. Thank you, the GSF and ERF and the also the commentator and the comments. Some of the issues that have been raised by Dr. Adnan, actually, it was probably in the first meeting that how far we can go and regarding exchange rate and the bank and what can be done in terms of enhancing competitiveness. Of course, it's in the back of our mind, but this issue, it is somehow a taboo, but how close we can get, of course, but we cannot just leave it. I want also to respond to Dr. Ibrahim because he said that what are the immediate measures? Because in the presentation, Dr. Zafiris has talked about 328 measures or so. I was writing down how to prioritize. I just want to, of course, it's not, we will be thinking about immediate measures, Ibrahim, in terms of what can be done, but also with a caveat, because I don't want to fall or us to fall in the trap of taking immediate measures, short-term solutions at the account of longer-term solutions, because this is what has been, you know, low-hanging fruits, immediate measures, but these measures have never been able to sort of reverse and address the real issue. So we have, if we're talking about structural issue that we have addressed in terms of either the debt size, its sustainability, employment versus really these are takes, and that's why even in my introductory remark I talk about how we can manage this transition in a way. But of course, it's a very well taken point in terms of what can be done in the short term. And the last thing probably it's the commitment, because also Dr. Adnan talked about, you know, we're all lacking this, but that lacking the real commitments and the price that associates. This is something probably we haven't addressed enough in this version, is that the now at least governments stay in office for 3-4 years. But before 1 year, 11 months, 9 months, of course, any prime minister would not sort of, would rather leave with some social capital, but with, you know, debt behind him, rather than taking serious measures that can be unpopular, etc. But thank you again for all the comments, and maybe the last word is on the taxation system and the tax burden, and something that is related to the sustainability that we probably have to again look into details, of course.
Thank you so much. I don't know, Dr. Ibrahim Badawi, if you have any comment.
No, I just like
Okay,
I just like to thank you again and to express our appreciation to this very insightful and engaging conversation, and to the authors and commentators, and to the you, Dr. Nasreen, and the other and the other chairpersons, and to thank you again, and look forward to the next round before the annual conference, when we expect to have the final presentations of the complete papers.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ibrahim, and allow me as well to thank Dr. Ibrahim Saif, Dr. Zaviris, Mr. Layth Al-Ajlouni, as well as our commenters, Dr. Miri and Dr. Adnan, for their insightful and important comments. We look forward again to have another discussion actually on the final paper, but this time let's invite the private sector and the government on the table to discuss the various issues, especially the question, which is why the private sector is not growing. Thank you so much.